In the autumn of 1894, 11 children lived in the small fishing settlement of Kowan Bay on the Argyll coast of western Scotland. By the following spring, not one of them remained. What happened in the caves below the cliffs during those 6 winter months has never been formally explained, though I witnessed enough of it to understand that some places on this earth belong to things far older than we do, and that there are creatures in the deep and the dark that have no interest in sharing their domains with the living. My name is Thomas Grayson, and I am now 87 years old. I've lived most of my life far from that coastline, in the inland valleys of Perthshire, where the land rises high enough that you can forget the sea exists at all. But I will not forget what I saw in the autumn of 1894, since when I was a young man of 24, working as a farm hand and sometime constable's assistant in the settlement of Kowan. I will not forget the weight of the fog that rolled in from the Atlantic every evening, thick enough that you could not see your hand before your face. I will not forget the sound of the children crying in the dark, or the way the villagers looked at one another when we understood that something had taken them down into the caves and would not give them back. Let me tell you how it began, which was not with violence or screaming, but with something far more ordinary that we at first mistook for simple carelessness. The first child to disappear was Margaret Auld, a girl of 9 years, the daughter of William Auld, who kept sheep on the hillside north of the village. On the morning of the 23rd of October, Margaret was sent by her mother to gather mussels from the rocks below the settlement. The tide was low, and the shingle beds near the great cave mouths were exposed, their surfaces gleaming and slick with seaweed. Margaret had collected mussels there dozens of times before, and no one thought to worry when she did not return for her midday meal. It was her mother who first walked down to the shore to look for her in the late afternoon. The sun was already descending behind the hills, and the first fingers of fog were beginning to creep inland from the sea. What Margaret's mother found was a small wooden basket half filled with mussels and a single boot print in the wet shingle that led toward the largest of the cave mouths, and then simply stopped, as though Margaret had stepped into shadow and been swallowed by it. The boot print was clear enough that William Auld could see the sole pattern and the small heel that his daughter's shoe had made. He followed that track himself, his heart climbing into his throat, and when he reached the cave mouth, he called her name into the darkness, his voice swallowed immediately by the immensity of the space and the sound of water dripping far below. No answer came back to him, except his own echo. We searched for Margaret Auld through that first night and all the following day, moving through the rocks with lanterns and calling her name until our voices grew hoarse. The constable came from the inland village, a man named James Morrison, who had never paid much attention to the coastal settlements and showed little patience for what he considered a waste of time. He examined the boot print, questioned William and his wife, and concluded that the child had either fallen into the sea during a moment of carelessness or had been taken by some vagrant passing through the region. Neither explanation satisfied those of us who lived there and knew the tides and the rocks. We knew that a child could not simply vanish into the sea from that shore without leaving some trace, a bonnet or a scrap of cloth, some piece of evidence that the water had claimed her. And we knew that no vagrant would have left that boot print so precisely at the cave mouth, as though the child had been led there by something deliberate. Old Murdoch MacDonald, who was then in his 70s and had lived his entire life in Kowan, spoke to the constable about the caves. And he said that his grandfather had warned him never to venture into the large cave mouth at the north end of the settlement, and that his grandfather's father had warned him the same. He said that there were stories passed down through the Gaelic-speaking families of the region about something that lived in the deep places beneath the cliffs, something that had been there long before any of us had built our homes above it. He called it by a name I can barely remember now, something that translated roughly as the caller from the deep places, or the hunger that dwells below. The constable listened to this with obvious disdain, made a note in his little book, and declared that we had done what we could. He departed the next morning and advised us to inform the authorities if the child was found. Margaret Auld, was never found. Her parents left the settlement within a month, moving inland to Perth, and I never learned what became of them after that. But I remember the way her mother's face looked when she walked down to the beach and saw that boot print. I remember understanding in that moment that something had happened in Kowan that was not part of the ordinary world, something that did not fit into the constable's little book or into the explanations that sensible men offered for the disappearances of children. 3 weeks passed after Margaret's disappearance, and the dark was coming earlier each day as we moved deeper into November. The fog thickened. The wind shifted to come down from the north, carrying with it the smell of deep water and stone. And then a second child vanished, and this time in a manner that could not be explained away as a carelessness or accident. The second child was David Kinloch, a boy of 7 whose family kept chickens and sold eggs to the other families in the settlement. David had been sent by his mother to collect firewood from the beach, a task he performed most afternoons, gathering the bits of driftwood that had been cast up by the tide. It was not yet 4 o'clock when he left his mother's house, and the light was beginning to fail, but the work was simple, and the beach was only a short walk down the path. David's mother expected him to return within the hour. He never returned at all. When David did not come back by the time darkness had fully settled, his mother went to fetch him. She found his bag half filled with firewood lying on the shingle, and she found something else that made her cry out loud enough that the neighbors heard her from their houses. She found David's coat dropped in the sand as though he had simply walked out of it and continued on without it. His mother picked up the coat with shaking hands and saw that it was completely dry, not wet or salt-stained as it would have been if David had waded into the water. It was as though he had been warm enough that he no longer needed it, or as though something had made him take it off before drawing him away into the dark. I was among those who searched for David that night, and I remember the terrible quality of the darkness on that beach, the way our lanterns seemed to make the shadows deeper rather than dispelling them. We searched along the tide line and called David's name until we were hoarse. And when some of the older men ventured carefully to the mouth of the main cave and called into it, their voices echoing back to them as though from a great distance. One of those men, a fisherman named Robert Guthrie, said afterward that he heard something that might have been a child's voice calling back from the depths, so faint and distant that he could not be certain of it, but the sound had come from far below, where any child could possibly have fallen. The settlement was afraid after David's disappearance. The fear had a quality that I had never experienced before and have never experienced since, a deep, primal dread that had nothing to do with the ordinary dangers of the sea or the winter. The women kept their children indoors constantly. The men gathered in the small trading house and discussed what might be done, but no one could suggest any action that would not amount to admitting that something impossible was happening in our midst. We are creatures who need explanation. We need to be able to say that a thing happened because of another thing that came before it. But there was no explanation for David Kinloch walking out of his coat on a beach at dusk and never being seen again. It was after David's disappearance that I began to pay serious attention to the sounds that came from the caves. I had lived in Kowan for only 2 years at that time, having come as a young man seeking work, and I had never taken much notice of the caves, except to understand that they were old and deep and dangerous, places where the tide could trap you and the passages could lead you in circles until you became lost. But now, in the evenings as the fog rolled in from the sea, I began to hear sounds coming from the cave mouths that I could not account for with any ordinary explanation. The sound was like singing, but not quite. It was more like the sound of wind passing through a structure, the way wind sounds when it moves through a canyon or a gorge, but it had a quality of intention to it that wind does not possess. It rose and fell with a rhythm that seemed almost musical, and it was pitched in such a way that it created a sensation in my chest, a kind of resonance that I felt more than heard. When I mentioned this to the other men, some of them said they had heard it too, but others insisted that I was imagining things, that it was only the wind and the sea combining their sounds in the darkness. But the people who said this were the ones who had not lost children yet. The ones who had lost children did not attempt to explain it away. In the first week of December, a third child disappeared. Her name was Catherine MacLeod, and she was 14, old enough that we all held some hope that she might be more capable of caring for herself than the younger children had been. Catherine had been walking to the well that stood inland from the settlement, a walk she had made hundreds of times. The well was only a quarter-mile from the village houses, but it required passing through a small hollow where the path wound down between two hills before ascending again toward the well. Catherine's mother saw her daughter leave with a water bucket in her hand, and no one witnessed Catherine again. What was found of Catherine was her water bucket, and was lying on its side on the path in the hollow. There were no signs of struggle, no torn clothing, no blood, nothing that would suggest violence of any kind. The bucket was simply lying there, and Catherine was gone. A search of the surrounding hills revealed nothing. Constable Morrison was called again, and this time his patience was worn thin. He suggested that the girl had run away, perhaps with a young man she had taken a fancy to, and that we should not involve him in the private scandals of our settlement. He returned to his inland office, and we did not see him again until the end of that month, when he was forced to come back because we had reported 4 missing persons to the authorities in Perth. The sounds from the caves grew louder and more frequent after Catherine's disappearance. I heard them nearly every evening, and I was not alone in this. The older men of the settlement began to speak openly about the old stories, the tales that had been passed down through generations about what lived in the caves. One of them was a man named Angus MacTavish, who had been born in Kowan and had lived his entire life there. He told us that his grandmother had once warned him that the caves were the home of something that predated human settlement in this region, something that had dwelt in those passages since before the Gaels came to Scotland. He said that according to the old stories, this creature could not abide living alongside humans, but neither could it leave its home. It had therefore developed a practice of taking the young, drawing them down into the caves and down deeper still, into passages that no human had ever fully explored. It took them not to kill them, Angus said, but to change them, to make them something other than human so that they would no longer be separated from it by the gulf between species. I did not know whether to believe this story or not. I was a young man, educated somewhat beyond the level of many of the fishermen and farmers around me, and I had learned to distrust the old folklore as the superstitious imaginings of people who did not understand the workings of nature. But the boot print of Margaret Auld, the coat of David Kinloch, the bucket of Catherine MacLeod, these things were real. These things had happened in daylight or the last light before dark, on the paths and the beaches of our settlement. These things did not fit into any explanation that I had learned. After Catherine's disappearance, the settlement changed. The women became harder in their manner, their faces sealed shut with fear and determination. The men drank more, gathering in the trading house in the evenings and speaking in low voices about what should be done. Some of them spoke about leaving, about abandoning Kowan and moving inland to greater safety. Others insisted that we could not simply surrender to fear, that there must be some course of action we could take to protect ourselves and recover the children who had been lost. But no one could suggest what that action might be. In the second week of December, a 4th child disappeared. This was a boy of 6 named Thomas Mackay, and he vanished from his own house in the middle of the afternoon, not on a beach or a path, but in his own home, while his mother was in an adjoining room. His mother heard nothing, saw nothing. She simply turned around, and her son was no longer where he had been sitting by the fire. A window stood open that had been closed, though how a 6-year-old boy could have opened it without making some sound, without disturbing the curtain, no one could explain. Searchers found no tracks outside the window, no sign of where the child had gone. This disappearance broke something in the settlement. It was no longer possible to maintain the pretense that the children were being taken by forces that operated according to rational principle, by human kidnappers or by natural accidents. The thing that was taking them had now demonstrated that it could reach into our homes, that no locked door or closed window would protect us from it. Parents became frantic. Families began to pack their belongings. Meetings were called, though no meetings produced any solution to the problem that confronted us. It was at this point, in the middle of December, with winter fully upon us, and the cliffs shrouded nearly every day in fog so thick you could not see 20 feet in any direction, that Constable Morrison finally returned to the settlement, and with him came a decision that the authorities in Perth and Edinburgh had made regarding what they called the situation in Kowan. The authorities had decided that the disappearances had reached a point where they could no longer ignore the matter. But instead of sending investigators or soldiers or any form of official help, they had decided to send word that the constable should make one definitive investigation of the caves and determine once and for all whether something was actually occurring in them or whether the people of Kowan were suffering from some form of collective delusion brought on by the winter darkness. Constable Morrison approached this task with the air of a man who believed he would find nothing, and that when he found nothing, he would be able to demonstrate that the concerns of the settlement were baseless. He gathered 2 volunteers, and I was present in the meeting where he made this request. One of those who volunteered was Robert Guthrie, the fisherman who had heard what might have been a child's voice echoing from the caves. The other was James Rourke, and a farmer who had lived in Kowan longer than almost anyone except Angus McTavish. Both men were considered brave and sensible. Neither of them was particularly prone to fanciful thinking or superstition. The descent into the caves was scheduled for the 23rd of December. I will mark that date in my memory until the day I die. The morning of that day was grey and cold, with the fog rolling in from the sea in waves, so thick that the houses across the street from where I stood became invisible within minutes. Constable Morrison equipped himself with a strong lantern and a rope and a pistol, items that seemed absurdly inadequate for what we all knew he would not find, but feared he might encounter. Robert Guthrie carried another lantern and a knife. James Rourke carried a rope and a revolver. They descended into the caves at midday, so when such light as existed was at its strongest, and we gathered above the cave mouth to wait for their return. We waited through the afternoon. We waited into the evening. The light that had been grey became darker until the only illumination was the reflected light from the lanterns within the cave, a faint and sickly glow that seemed to be swallowed by the fog. We could not see into the caves themselves, but we could sometimes hear sounds coming from within them, echoes of movement or speech that were distorted and made strange by the stone. No one spoke much. We had brought blankets and cloaks, and we huddled together against the cold and the damp. Some of the women had brought lanterns of their own, and they held them up as though the light might somehow draw the 3 men back out from the darkness. 6 hours passed. Then 7. The fog thickened until it became impossible to see anything at all, and the sounds from the cave became more difficult to interpret. It was sometime after 9 o'clock in the evening, as near as we could judge without being able to see a timepiece clearly, that Constable Morrison emerged from the cave mouth. He walked out of the darkness unsteadily, like a drunk man or a man whose mind was no longer fully in control of his body. His face was white, almost luminous in the darkness. His uniform was soaked through with water and with what might have been cave slime, something thick and faintly iridescent that caught the light of the lanterns we held up to illuminate him. Behind him, there was nothing. Robert Guthrie did not emerge. James Rourke did not emerge. Only Constable Morrison came back out of the caves, and he was not the same man who had descended into them 6 hours earlier. He did not speak, did not acknowledge our questions or our concern. He simply walked past us toward the path that led to the settlement, moving with the careful deliberation of someone walking in his sleep. We followed him, and he did not turn to look at any of us. In the days that followed, Constable Morrison refused to describe what he had encountered in the caves. He gave a statement to the authorities in Perth that said only that the caves were deeper and more extensive than had been believed, that passages descended far into the earth, and that, in his estimation, it was impossible to search them fully with the resources available. Regarding the fate of Robert Guthrie and James Rourke, he would say nothing at all. I spoke with him several times, asked him directly what he had seen, and he looked at me with an expression of such profound disturbance that I ceased asking. He left the settlement before the end of December and never returned. I learned years later that he had left the constable service entirely and had taken to drinking heavily, and that he died in an institution in Edinburgh at the age of 52, never having spoken to anyone about what had happened in those caves on December the 23rd of 1894. After the constable's expedition, the settlement fell into a state of near panic. The departure of 2 men into the caves without returning, the visible disturbance of the constable, the ongoing silence from the authorities in Perth, all of this convinced the people of Kowan that we were facing something that no official help would be able to address. Parents began to remove their children from their beds at night and keep them close, watching over them constantly. Some families slept in shifts, with one adult always awake, always vigilant, their eyes never leaving their children. But vigilance seemed not to matter. The creature would not be kept out by closed doors or watchful parents or the prayers of frightened people. Between the constable's expedition and the end of December, 2 more children disappeared. One was Margaret Simmons, age 11, who was taken from the path she was walking in the afternoon while people were working in their gardens only a stone's throw away. No one heard her cry out. No one saw anything. One moment she was there, walking toward her home with a package of flour purchased from the trading house, and the next moment she was gone. The flour was found on the path, the package split open and the flour spilled across the stone. The other was John MacLeod, the cousin of Catherine MacLeod, who had disappeared earlier in December. John was a boy of 9, and he was taken from his family's house in the evening while his parents and siblings were gathered around the fire. There was a sound like wind, a distant singing sound from outside the house, and when his mother turned to check on him, John was no longer sitting beside her. His boots were on the floor where he had been sitting, but he was gone. At this point, families began to leave the settlement in earnest. Not as an organized exodus, but as individual acts of flight, and families packing what they could carry and hiring someone with a cart or a horse to convey them inland to places where the ground did not harbor such mysteries. By the new year, more than half the settlement had left. Those of us who remained were bound together by a desperation that I could not fully understand. Some of us were waiting for news from the authorities. Others seemed almost unable to move, as though we had been paralyzed by fear to remaining in a place of danger. A few of us, I think, harbored some desperate hope that if we understood the thing that was taking the children, if we could somehow communicate with it or appeal to it, we might stop it or retrieve the children who had been lost. It was in this state of fractured purpose and deepening dread that I made a decision that I have never been entirely certain was right. Yet in the weeks following Constable Morrison's expedition, I became convinced that I needed to descend into the caves myself, not to search for anything as foolish as rescue, but simply to understand. I had heard the sounds that the creature made. I had felt the presence of something ancient and intent in the fog that rolled in from the sea. I believed that if I could see the caves from the inside, if I could move through them and understand their geometry and their depth, I would be able to understand something about what it was that dwelt in them. I confess that I was also driven by a wish to prove something, to myself and to others, that I was not afraid, that I was capable of doing what the constable had refused to do. I did not believe that I would descend into the caves and find Robert Guthrie and James Rourke waiting for me, and or find the children alive. But I believed that I might find some evidence of what had happened to them, some sign that would allow the settlement to understand the nature of the horror that had come among us. I told no one of my intention to descend into the caves. I prepared myself carefully, taking a strong lantern that I borrowed from one of the remaining families, taking rope and matches and a knife. I also took a revolver that had belonged to my father, though I had no belief that a gun would be any defense against a creature that moved through the earth in the darkness. I descended at dawn on the 28th of December, when the fog was slightly less thick than it had been in previous days, when there was at least a pale light above the cliffs that suggested a sun somewhere beyond the clouds. The mouth of the cave yawned before me, a darkness so complete that it seemed to have weight, to be pressing outward against the grey morning light. The opening was at least 20 feet across and perhaps 15 feet high, and the rock around it was smooth and oddly symmetrical, as though it had been shaped by something other than erosion, though of course such a thought was absurd. The smell that came from the cave was not the smell of seawater and stone that I had expected. It was something more complex, something that contained notes of organic decay and of something else, something that was not quite stone and not quite plant, but some combination of the two, a green and earthy smell mixed with something that suggested deep time and ancient sleeping things. I lit my lantern and stepped into the darkness. The passage that led inward from the cave mouth was relatively smooth and wide, the floor covered with sand and fine pebbles that crunched beneath my boots. The walls were damp and glistening in my lantern light, and I could see channels worn into them by water that must flow through the caves during storms or during the high tides. As I walked deeper, the sound of the sea receded behind me, and a new sound began to emerge, a sound like water dripping far below and something else, something that might have been the echo of wind, or might have been the echo of something moving through the passages. The air grew colder as I descended, and my breath began to cloud in front of the lantern. After perhaps 100 yards of walking, the passage I was following opened into a larger chamber, and a space so vast that my lantern light could not reach either the ceiling or the far wall. The floor of this chamber was covered with sand, and embedded in the sand I could see objects, though my lantern light did not illuminate them clearly enough for me to understand what they were. I moved closer and held my lantern lower, and I understood that I was looking at bones, scattered and bleached and articulated in ways that suggested they had lain there for a very long time. I did not want to examine them closely. I did not want to know what creatures they had belonged to, but I could see that some of them were large, and some were small, and some were arranged in patterns that seemed almost intentional, as though something had placed them deliberately in the sand. I continued deeper into the caves, moving along the passages that grew progressively more complex, branching off into smaller tunnels and chambers, each one opening onto another. I began to understand why the constable had said that it was impossible to search the caves fully. The passages seemed to multiply and loop back on themselves, and I knew that without some method of marking my path, I might very quickly become lost in the darkness. I marked my path by means of scratches in the stone made with my knife, trying to cut deep enough that they would be easy to follow on my return. As I descended deeper, the sounds that I could hear became clearer. The dripping of water became louder, more insistent, and underneath it, I could hear the sound that I had heard so many times from above the caves. And the singing sound that had no words and no clear melody, but seemed to come from a vast distance and to contain in it the echoes of voices that were neither wholly human nor wholly animal. This sound grew louder as I descended, as though I was moving toward its source. And along with the sound came other sensations, a feeling of being watched, of being drawn forward by some force that was not physical, but was nonetheless real. I found it increasingly difficult to remain unmoved by this pull. Part of me wanted to turn back, to return to the grey light of the morning and the settlement above. But another part of me, a part that seemed to be growing stronger the deeper I went, wanted to continue forward, to see where the passages led, to understand the source of the singing. The passages grew narrower as I descended. Mud and the walls became rougher, as though at some point the careful work of water erosion gave way to something else, something that had been shaped by intention and not by the patient action of time. The walls were no longer simply stone, but seemed to be covered with something that was neither plant nor stone, something that was soft to the touch and faintly warm, and that glowed with a faint bioluminescence that gave off a sickly, pale green light. This light grew brighter as I descended, and I found that I could begin to see without my lantern, though I kept it lit for comfort more than necessity. The stone walls of the passages seemed to be alive with the growth of this strange luminescent material, and in places it formed shapes that almost resembled faces or hands or bodies pressed against the stone. And I did not want to think about what this material might be, or what force of nature or supernatural origin might have created it. I descended for perhaps 3 hours, I think, though time became difficult to measure in that place where there was no sun and no star and no changing of light to mark the passage of moments. The passages had grown so narrow that in some places I had to turn sideways to fit through them, and the air had become so cold that my breath came in long, white clouds that did not dissipate, but hung in the still air like ghosts. The singing sound had become almost unbearably loud, and I realized that it was no longer coming from some distant source, but was all around me, emanating from the very walls of the passages, vibrating through the stone itself. And it was at a point where 3 passages converged into a larger chamber that I finally saw something that I could identify as direct evidence of the children who had been taken. In the sand of the chamber floor I found a boot, the same style and size as the boots that the children of the settlement wore, covered in the dust of the caves. Near to it I found a ribbon, the kind that young girls used to tie in their hair, faded blue with embroidery that had once been fine but was now aged and worn. I did not pick these items up. I did not want to contaminate them with my touch or to bring them any closer to the light where I would have to see them clearly. I simply noted their position and continued deeper into the caves. In the chamber where I found those items opened onto a passage that descended more steeply than any of the others I had entered, and the walls of this passage were absolutely covered with the strange luminescent growth. The green light grew brighter and brighter until I could no longer see anything beyond the passage itself, and my lantern had become unnecessary. I extinguished it and continued forward, drawn by the singing and by something else, a compulsion that seemed to have rooted itself in my chest and that pulled me downward with a force that I could not resist. At the bottom of this passage, the ground fell away into a vast and bottomless darkness. I stopped at the edge of a chasm, and for the first time in my descent, I was fully afraid. The chasm was vast beyond measure, and a void that seemed to contain all the darkness that had ever existed in the world. The singing was coming from this chasm, rising up from it like the breath of something sleeping far below, and the walls of the chasm were covered with the luminescent material, forming patterns and shapes that seemed to have intention and meaning, though I could not understand what they signified. I stood at the edge of this chasm for a long time, and I began to understand what the constable must have understood when he descended into these caves, what had broken him and driven him to silence and to drink. I understood that there was something in this place that was older than we were, something that had been sleeping here in the dark for longer than human civilization had existed. And I understood that this thing was not evil in any sense that human morality could comprehend. It was simply ancient, and it was simply hungry, and it was simply lonely. It had drawn the children down into its darkness, not out of cruelty, but out of a need so profound and so alien to human understanding that it expressed itself as an unstoppable hunger. I do not know how long I stood at the edge of that chasm, but at some point a kind of clarity came to me, a realization that I did not belong in this place, that no human being belonged in this place, and that the only proper course of action was to leave and to tell the people of Kowan that there was no rescue possible, that the children who had been taken had passed into a realm that no living human could reach or retrieve them from. I turned away from the chasm and I retraced my steps back through the passages, following the scratches that I had made in the stone. The singing followed me as I ascended, not growing fainter but fading gradually as I climbed, as though the creature or the force or the place itself was releasing me, understanding that I was not meant to be taken into the darkness. I emerged from the cave mouth as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of red and orange that seemed impossibly bright after the green darkness of the passages. I was soaked through with cold water, though I could not remember entering water deep enough to soak me. My hands were shaking, and I felt as though I had been absent from the world for far longer than the single day that had passed. The settlement was waiting for me, although no one had known where I had gone. But the moment I emerged from the caves, they seemed to understand what I had done, and they did not ask me to describe it. That night, I told the remaining leaders of the settlement what I had decided based on my descent into the caves. I did not tell them what I had seen or what I had felt. I simply told them that the caves were too deep and too complex to be fully explored, that any rescue operation would be futile and dangerous, and that the proper course of action was to accept that the children who had been taken were lost and to abandon the settlement. Some of the remaining families had already come to this conclusion independently. Others resisted the idea, unable to accept that their children had been taken and would never be returned. But by the end of that week, so the decision had been made. We would leave Kowan. We would leave it to the creature that dwelt in its caves, and we would take with us only what we could carry and the knowledge that there were some things that human determination and human courage could not overcome. The evacuation of Kowan took place over the course of the first 2 weeks of January. Families packed their belongings and made arrangements for transportation inland. The constable from the inland village came to help organize the evacuation and to assure us that the authorities in Perth would make some effort to guard against the possibility of whatever lurked in the caves from spreading beyond the settlement. This assurance seemed to carry no actual weight or meaning, and I think all of us understood that no guard could be placed against such a thing, that it would remain in the caves where it had always been, taking what it wished to take, and that the only defense available to us was to remove ourselves from its domain. I was among the last to leave Kowan, departing on the 15th of January with a farmer named Duncan Mackay, who was loading his wagon with the last of his possessions. As we drove away from the settlement, I looked back at the houses that had been home to us, at the paths and the rocks and the shore, at the fog that was rolling in from the sea as it had rolled in every evening for the months that I had lived there. I saw in my mind the boot print of Margaret Auld in the sand, the coat of David Kinloch dropped beside the water, the bucket of Catherine MacLeod lying on the path. When I saw in my mind the descent into the caves and the vast and terrible chasm that lay at their heart, and I understood, with a clarity that has only deepened in the 70 years since I left that place, that the world is far older than we are, and that there are things in the dark places of that world that have no interest in sharing their domains with the living. In the years that followed, I heard various explanations offered for what had happened in Kowan. Some people suggested that a criminal had taken the children and hidden them inland, that the caves had nothing to do with their disappearance. Others claimed that the children had drowned themselves in a mass suicide brought on by the darkness and isolation of the winter. The authorities in Edinburgh made a report that concluded the disappearances were likely due to a combination of accidents and negligence on the part of the parents, and that the settlement had abandoned prematurely due to mass hysteria. All of these explanations were false. All of them were the inventions of people who did not understand what I understood, who had not descended into the darkness as I had, who had not felt the pull of something ancient and vast and utterly indifferent to human welfare. The settlement of Kowan was never re-established. The buildings fell into disrepair and eventually collapsed. The land itself was eventually purchased by a wealthy landowner who left it largely undeveloped, and when I was a younger man, I attempted to return there to see what remained. I did not go to the caves, and I could not bring myself to return to that place, no matter how many years had passed. But I walked around the abandoned settlement and saw the ruins of the houses and the tumbled stones of the buildings, and I felt the presence of something vast and ancient in the fog that rolled in from the sea. I understood that the creature that had taken the children was still there, still patient, still waiting in the darkness, and I understood that my departure from Kowan had not been a victory or a defeat, but simply an acknowledgement of a fact that humans have known since the beginning of time. There are places on this earth that do not belong to us, places that belong to older things, and the wise course is to leave those places to the creatures that have always dwelt in them. The children of Kowan, all 11 of them, were never found. Their families eventually dispersed to other parts of Scotland and beyond, and I'm certain that all of them carried the weight of loss until the day they died. But I believe also that they carried something else, a knowledge that their children had passed into a state of being that was neither death nor life, but something other, something that no human vocabulary can describe. In my dreams, sometimes I hear the singing that I heard in the caves, and I wonder if somewhere in the vast darkness beneath the cliffs, the children are singing too, changed and transformed into something other than what they were, belonging to the ancient thing that had taken them, no longer separated from it by the gulf between species. I'm old now, and I will not see many more winters. I've lived a long and quiet life inland, far from the coast. I married a good woman and raised a family of my own, built a life that was as ordinary and stable as I could make it. But I have never entirely left Kowan. Part of me remains in those caves, in the darkness beneath the cliffs, in the presence of something vast and patient and hungry. And I believe that if I were to return to that place today, if I were to descend into the caves once more, I would find that nothing had changed. The creature would still be there. The darkness would still be waiting. The singing would still echo from the depths, beautiful and terrible and utterly indifferent to the passage of human time. There are some who believe that the creatures of our oldest folklore are merely inventions of the human imagination, products of fear and ignorance and superstition. I do not believe this, and I believe instead that our folklore preserves memory of things that are real, things that our ancestors encountered in the wild places of the world before civilization drove them into ever smaller corners of the earth. These creatures are not evil because they are not moral agents. They simply are, ancient and vast and utterly removed from human understanding. We share a world with them, though we are usually fortunate enough never to encounter them directly. But in places like Kowan, in the caves and the dark passages that lie beneath the surface of the earth, these creatures still exist, waiting, patient, unchanged by all the progress and civilization and science that humans have accumulated over the centuries. The fog still rolls in from the Atlantic every evening along the Argyll coast. The caves at Kowan still open their dark mouths toward the sea. And somewhere far below, in the darkness that no human has fully explored, something ancient and powerful still dwells, still waiting, still hungry for the young whose voices can penetrate the veil between the human world and the realm of older things. I have told this story to very few people in my life. Most of those who might have corroborated the events of 1894 are now dead. The constable died in silence. The families who fled Kowan are scattered or gone. But I have lived to tell this truth, and I offer it now not as proof of anything, but simply as a record of what happened in a small Scottish settlement when ancient forces and human ignorance collided in the darkness of a winter that seems now to have occurred not in the recent past, but in some other age of the world entirely.